Hi, everybody. Hi. Shannon, I should tell you about an introduction I had a couple years ago that it was actually a really great introduction that is very much how I feel of being here. I was invited to speak to a group of Latino Christian leaders, and it was one of their first big public meetings, and I was the first kind of white guy who'd ever been asked to speak to this group. And so the fellow introducing me, his name is Gabriel. Gabriel went up to the mic and said, well, I'd like to say, first of all, it is not an honor for us to have Brian McLaren here to speak. It is an honor that we would invite Brian McLaren to speak. And his fellow board members were mortified that I would be insulted. But I got it. He was right. It was an honor for a group of Latino leaders to be willing to listen to another white guy, because white guys are going around talking all the time. You know what I mean? And I feel very much that way to be invited to speak to this group, because there are so many people in the room who have been struggling with issues of theology and peace a lot longer than I have. And there are people here whose depth and grappling with the work of René Girard is so much deeper than mine. And in fact, it was a gift to be invited to be part of this, because part of my preparation was to deepen my engagement with Girard. So it truly is an honor for me to speak to you all. I have enjoyed everybody I've met. There are a few old friends in the room who we have a lot of history together, but so many folks here I'm just meeting for the first time. So I'm very honored to be invited to speak and to talk about the issues we've grappled with in relation to the Christian faith, our work in local churches. So many people share this feeling that I've had, that I'm caught between something real and something wrong. There's something real in my faith. I can't leave it without feeling I'm betraying something precious and good. But I can't stay without having to acknowledge that something doesn't smell right, and that something feels fishy. And that struggle forces me to acknowledge that I have been formed in the context of Christian faith. I have been transformed. Who I am and what I've become is deeply and positively affected by my faith. Shoot, I've even been reformed. You know, I was a tulip guy for a while, so I've really been there. But anyway, for those of you who don't know what that means, that's just fine. But I also have to acknowledge that there are parts of me that have been harmed by my engagement with Christian faith, with the Christian religion. Parts of me that have been deformed and malformed. And so much for me is the issue of how our faith is framed, what you might call the pre-critical assumptions we bring to the faith. The assumptions about what problems it's trying to solve, what it's for, what the big story is that's going on here. And so I've been in a process now, going on 20 years, a process of feeling that if I was going to stay a Christian, I had to redefine the term. And I had to face the things that something inside me said were wrong, and I had to stop tolerating those things and being in denial about them. I had to face them. Not only things that were wrong, but also things that were missing and were needed, without throwing out the things that were precious. And so if you just look at the titles of my books, it's pretty obvious what my struggles have been. Looking for something on the other side, a sense of being in transition, and there's something better on the other side. Looking for a new kind of Christian identity, generous orthodoxy, finding that point that we're missing. Finding the story that we seem to have lost. Giving the message that has strangely been a secret to us. Grappling with change that's needed, discovering our way, discovering Christian faith as a way, as it originally was. Most recently, grappled with an essential and naked and kind of primal and core spirituality. Now, some of the theological problems we have are modular, meaning you can take out your creationist model and put in an evolution model, and you can substitute your old dispensational eschatology model for a new covenant theology model. You know, we've got a lot of modular problems like that, and a lot of us have probably changed a lot of modules in our lives. You went from penal substitutionary atonement, took out that model and re-plugged in the Christus Victor atonement, whatever it might have been. But sometimes you start to get the feeling that the problems are not modular that we're dealing with. The problems are systemic. And that the changes that we have to grapple with are more than substituting little parts, that there is some bigger systemic issue. And that's really where René Girard, I think, has made a huge contribution that brings together a group of people like this. Speaking very personally, if I were to say what about Girard's work I find is most valuable to me, first, the nonviolent theme of the Bible. To be honest with you, all of the theory of mimesis and scapegoating, I get that, and it has grown on me over time. But what really won me to Girard was watching the way he read the Bible and feeling that he was doing justice to things in the biblical text that made other ways of reading the biblical text seem somewhat like cardboard or somewhat like styrofoam in comparison to something nutritious and organic. The ability to give us back a narrative of evolution or emergence, both before the biblical text and in the biblical text, I think is tremendously important. I mean, since Darwin, the dominant myth of our civilization is the myth of evolution. I'm not saying myth that it's not true. I'm saying myth as a structuring narrative. And as you'll see in a couple of minutes, I think a problem with historic Christian faith is that it couldn't cope with the narrative of evolution for a whole lot of reasons. And so being able to bring us back into a larger story or myth of evolution, I think, is tremendously important. Obviously, his ability to deconstruct traditional atonement theories, incredibly important, because issues of atonement are, as Michael said yesterday, this is a historic, in the history of the Christian faith, this questioning of atonement is profound and historic, very important. Maybe the most valuable thing I think Girard almost does as a spin on the ball, not so much the direction of the pitch, but it's a spin on the ball, is he presents Christ as unique but not exclusive. He presents Christ as being both unique and universal. And that there are not many people who do that. A lot of people present Christ as being unique and exclusive, or universal but not unique. And this is a fascinating combination we could maybe talk about more later. I think I just most recently read a book that I have sent for those of you who are very deeply Girardian. It has caused something of a stir, but his book, Fighting Until the End, Battling Until the End, sorry. People do this to my titles all the time too. So. But I do think that, right as I'm reading Battling to the End, I'm reading Zizek's book, Living in the End Times, and I just finished The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. So I'm deeply enmeshed or deeply engaged right now with apocalyptic environmental writings, And I do think a proper apocalypticism is tremendously important. Not the apocalyptics of prediction, but the apocalyptics of warning and challenge. I think all of us who read some Girard feel he really has a diagnosis of what's gone wrong, and I think he helps us get that sense of what is good and real and why it's so good and real. And so tremendously important. Just a couple of quotes to set us up from Girard. A nonviolent deity Oh, and I should frame these by saying, one of our struggles is we're part of a faith that's 2,000 years old. And it is not easy to go back and say our 2,000-year history is very checkered. I don't think any of us are in the boat of wanting to scapegoat Christianity and turn Christianity into the bad guy and all the rest. I mean, there are a lot of people who are doing that, and they've got their stuff they're working out. And frankly, the Christian faith needs to hear what Richard Dawkins and so on, Sam Harris and so on. I think they're important voices in the community of faith. They have critiques that have to be heard. And the fury and anger with which they hurl their critiques, that's part of the data we've got to hear. And so that's great. I think the Holy Spirit is speaking to us through Richard Dawkins and company. But for those of us who are in the faith, saying, why is it taking us so long to get it? So these are a couple of quotes that maybe help me not become comfortable with that, but accept, somehow be able to live with it, you know. A nonviolent deity can only signal his existence to mankind by having himself driven out by violence, by him demonstrating that he is not able to establish himself in the kingdom of violence. But this very demonstration is bound to remain ambiguous for a very long time. And it is not capable of achieving a decisive result, since it looks like total impotence to those who live under the regime of violence. That is why, at first, it can only have some effect under a guise. A deceptive through the admixture of some sacrificial elements, through the surreptitious reinsertion of some violence into the conception of the divine. Do you feel that? One way to say this is, I wrote a blog post. Remember when Anne Rice announced that she was quitting Christian faith? I have a bit of a friendship with Anne Rice. It happened in an interesting way. She wrote her first installment of her biography of Jesus, and it was called Christ the Lord. And it turns out I'd read a couple of my books and contacted me through a priest, friend of hers, and she said, Brian, I have no Protestant friends. She said, could you read this book and tell me what parts of it will offend Protestants? So I can sort of, decide if I really want to do that or not, And so it was very sweet. And so when she announced that she was quitting Christianity, I felt it was appropriate to respond. And I at the end of my response, I said, I am so sympathetic to Anne. I understand why she wants to quit Christianity. I said, but I've decided to stay. I'm not criticizing her. I think sometimes people only listen as people are walking away. So I'm glad that she's walking away and not being quiet, but speaking about why she's walking away. But here's the reason I decided to stay. If I were to leave Christianity and join the religion that thought it was pure and finally had it right, that would be the scariest, worst thing of all. Do you see that? And of course, all the Protestants in the room, this is the history of Protestantism. And you just think, do we really want to do this again? And so that's why all the Girardians in the room have to remember, the last thing you want to do is have it right. Because the very nature of the way of God is through weakness and vulnerability and imperfection. And so I said, I think the most dangerous thing in the world is a religion that thinks it's pure and right. So the only religion I'd want to join is a discredited and failed religion. And I think that's exactly what Girard is saying here. If the way of God is going to come through, it has to come through people who are aware of their own violence and their own complicity in oppression and pride and all the rest. He goes on, another place, he says, behaving in a truly divine manner on an earth still in the clutches of violence means not dominating humans, not overwhelming them with supernatural power, means not terrifying and astonishing them in turn through the sufferings and blessings one can confer. It means not creating differences between doubles, not taking part in their disputes. And then he says, if God does this, if God makes no distinction between Greeks, Jews, men and women, etc., this can look like a complete indifference and can lead to the conclusion that the all-powerful does not exist, so long as his transcendence keeps him infinitely far from us in our violent undertakings. And there's a certain sense, as I read that, I remember thinking, yes, all of us in our religions want God to clearly show God as being on our side. But there's a certain sense God can't be on anybody's side who's part of this the world's violent regime. Of course, at that point, you hear a few Bob Dylan lines. There's no privileged stance from which absolute truth can be discovered. That is why the word that states itself to be absolutely true never speaks except from the position of a victim in the process of being expelled. The more powerful the truth, the more vulnerably it must be communicated. Otherwise, it becomes a totalizing meta-narrative. Otherwise, it becomes a dominant and crushing, oppressive, forceful, and we might even say violent truth. So for 2,000 years, this word has been misunderstood, despite the enormous amount of publicity it has received. The sacrificial concept of divinity, he says, around which our Western Christian faith has been so thoroughly centered, it must die, and with it the whole apparatus of historical Christianity. I think that's a staggering statement, and it might bother us, but let's just let it bother us for a minute. Maybe if you don't like it, at least say, what if he's right? And, for the Gospels to be able to rise again in our midst, not looking like a corpse that we've exhumed, but revealed as the newest, finest, liveliest, and truest thing that we have ever set eyes upon. And my sense is that's probably why a lot of us would take the time and effort to be at a gathering like this. We think Rene Girard is cool, but the truth is, we've gotten a fresh vision of the gospel in these kinds of terms. He says in historical Christianity, it covers the text with a veil of sacrifice, or to change the metaphor, it immolates them in the albeit splendid tomb of Western culture. I think Michael quoted this yesterday. The process of rediscovering the gospel, trying to get some of this tomb and cut veil away. He says this process requires an almost limitless patience. Many centuries must elapse before the subversive and shattering truth contained in the Gospels can be understood worldwide. And this is one of the interesting things when you're concerned about violence. It's very different than the old understanding of being saved. Because you could, as an individual, want to be right. But when you're concerned about violence, you're concerned about something that affects everybody. So the fact that nobody's beating up on you and we're not beating up on anybody is nice, but it doesn't make you say, well, who cares about Sudan? So suddenly you start to realize, yeah, we're in a long process, a long struggle. And it has to take time because you can't force people against their will to accept the good news. And of course, this reminds me of that passage in Matthew 13, where Jesus had just told the parable of the sower and the seed, which basically said, the project I'm involved with is going to have very limited success. A lot of the seeds are going to produce, nothing. A lot of it, and the disciples respond. Someone's going to ask, why do you speak to the people in parables? Which I can't help but hear as, this isn't working too well, Can you give me some advice? Try a little more direct approach. He replied, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. If this was just a matter of publicity, it would be one thing. But there is something deeper going on here that invites a deeper kind of hearing. I like the way Bhagavad Gita said it. The closest thing maybe we have to the philosopher king, in the last generation or two. Something is on the way out and something else is painfully being born. It is as if something were crumbling, decaying, and exhausting itself, while something else still indistinct were arising from the rubble. We are in a phase when one age is succeeding another, when everything is possible. That's the context that I wrote a book that came out about a year ago called The Kind of Christianity that some of you have read. I'm going to, and the book is built around 10 questions. And I intentionally wanted to frame the book around questions because 500 years ago we had something called the Protestant Reformation. It was based on theses. And theses are statements intended to create debate. And when they create debate, they're capable of bringing us to a new state. But in the process, they can produce a lot of hate. And so a lot of us feel we have enough debate and hate, and we don't just need to get to a new state. It's not like we just need to get from here to here. Because if you're converted from a world of stasis to a world of evolution and emergence and quest and development, then the last thing you want is to go from one state to another. You want to go from stasis to motion. Does that make sense? And so I felt the nice thing about questions is questions questions invite conversations that bring you on a new quest. And the quest is never done. And that to me is why I wanted to structure around questions. And there were 10. By the way, some of you I notice are furiously taking notes, and you're welcome to take notes. If that helps you stay awake. But I'll put these slides online. If you go to my website, which is brianmclaren.net, and they'll make a link to it at the site, you can you can have all these slides. But the questions that I had the chance to see at close range being raised around the world. I was a few months ago in the capital city of Burundi, Bujumbura, Burundi, and I couldn't believe it. Young adults in Bujumbura, Burundi, who've grown up in the prosperity gospel Pentecostal churches, are dropping out of church and forming little communities where they're grappling with trying to find a new kind of Christianity. And it's not because they've read my books. The only books available there are Benny Hinn and Joyce Meyer and those sort of folks. They're on their own saying it's unacceptable for us to perpetuate the kind of Christianity into which we've been brought. We're caught between something real and something wrong, and they're trying to work it out. And I've seen it. I was in Phnom Penh, Cambodia a few months ago. I'm just amazing to watch these conversations springing up all over the world. Amsterdam, Netherlands, a couple of weeks ago. Pentecostals and Dutch Reform in the same room, struggling with the same issues. It's remarkable. And it's this first question I'm going to focus on for a few minutes this morning. But if you want to ask about any of these, I'm going to end a little early so I have a lot of time for discussion. But this is the question, what is the big narrative? What is the big story? And in my opinion, this is where Girard's great contribution, of his many contributions, this is one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable, because he's nudging us out of what he would call a sacrificial narrative to a very, very different understanding of the biblical narrative. And I should just say, in full disclosure, I've been stumbling in this direction apart from Girard, and and you get to a certain place, and then you think, gosh, this guy's been there for 25 years, and you think, why did it take me so long? But anyway, I feel that about a lot of things. A huge issue about authority. How is the Bible authoritative? This is an especially big issue for Protestants. Although, isn't it interesting for all the Catholics in the room? I don't know if the Catholics in the room listen to Catholic radio, but where I live, we have 2 Catholic radio stations, both of which are imitating Protestantism in every possible way. It's just fascinating to watch them follow the Protestant religious broadcasting script. And they are becoming more and more Protestant as they imitate the Protestants. It's so fascinating to watch them out-Protestant the Protestants. In both content and form in some ways. And it's fascinating to watch that it's funny. I live in the South, deep South, so the primary goal of conversion is converting Protestants to Catholicism. But if you want to convert Protestants, you have to use the Bible to do it. You see where this goes? It becomes really interesting. So you use the Bible to prove the authority of the tradition of the church, and suddenly you're in the same ballgame. And it's just fascinating to watch. So all of us are thrust into this issue of how the Bible works and how it has authority. And again, for people who read Gerard, watching how he uses the Bible is stunning. And he is modeling, I think, guided by instinct and the Spirit, whatever else, modeling a different way of using the text. That's really quite elegant and fascinating. The deepest question of all, perhaps, is God violent? Jesus question. Who's Jesus? Why does he matter? Gospel question. What is this gospel? When you answer those first 4 questions differently, you have to answer the 5th question differently. Then that leads to some practical questions. What's the church for? What's it about? If we start with a different understanding of the gospel, it's going to lead to a very different understanding of the church. That's going to force us to grapple with the sex question, which I think is the tip of the iceberg for the deeper question, which is the anthropological question. Which again, Gerard is making very, very big contributions to, if in no other way, by giving us a chance, non-anthropologists, to think like anthropologists for a little while. The future question, eschatological question, very big. How do we relate to people of other faiths? Huge question. That's actually the subject for my next writing project. And then how can we deal with the first 9 questions without killing anybody? So what I'd like to do is take a couple of minutes and talk about this first question. What's the shape of the biblical narrative? And I'm from a fundamentalist evangelical background. So all of the people from my background, I'm pretty sure you could fill in this diagram. And mainline Protestants, you'd say, oh, we would never use a diagram like this. But you would be surprised how many mainline Protestants, this is really what they believe. And Roman Catholics, I think it's surprising how many Roman Catholics that if you scrape things away, this is the vision of the biblical narrative. And probably a lot of you, even if you've never seen a plot diagram like this, you know how to fill it in. A perfect Garden of Eden, a state, then something called a fall. And it's so interesting among Protestants, they love to use a big word, most of them don't know what it means, but they love to talk about the ontological fall, which is an absolutely stunning category. But at any rate, a fall, and then something called fallen history, or this fallen world. So interesting, especially because the word fallen and fallen never occur in the Bible in the way they're so essential to this understanding of the story. I'm not against it. There's some truth to it. I'm not throwing it, not saying no value. I'm just saying it's fascinating how we frame the story in this way. Now the word salvation takes meaning in light of that scenario. And then, of course, 2 ultimate possible outcomes. And my suspicion is that this comes from a necessary and well-meaning and maybe inescapable engagement of the 2nd century Christians with the reality of their world, which was Greek philosophy. And I don't think you could ever prove this, and sometimes I regret putting this in the book because it just gets you into all kinds of arguments you don't really care about having. You should hear, when the book came out, I have all these footnotes in the book about Plato, saying, well, Plato's brilliant. He's way too brilliant to be consistent. So, and just trying to get out of arguing about who has the right interpretation of Plato. And then the internet lit up with all these people arguing about whether I had the right interpretation of Plato or not. And my best conversation was with the guy who's devoted his entire life, he's a philosopher, to studying Plato. And I asked him what he thought about it because he read the book. And he said, Brian, I've spent my whole life studying Plato. I have no idea. And I thought there's an honest man. But my hunch is what we've ended up doing is turning the Christian gospel into an elucidation of Plato's cave. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
This becomes Plato's cave. And ironically, at the bottom of the cave, you're living in Aristotle's world. But the goal is to get out of it back into the state of perfection. And so I think our theology has been so deeply framed that But I don't think that's all. I also think it's the way then that Greek philosophy becomes useful, first to Greece, but then to Roman politics. And in a way, this becomes then a false narrative, but most historical and political narratives are false. But the way you can tell the story that the way the world is supposed to be run is by all wills being submitted to the will of an emperor who rules by divine right. And when people fall away from that, they fall into a barbarian state of uncivilization. And they're part of the undeveloped world. They're part of the third world. And we have to bring them through civilization, development, colonialism, assimilation, back into and now it's the Pax Americana and the Pax, the peace of capitalism and all the rest. And very much like the Borg in Star Trek, resistance is futile, you will be assimilated. And so I think this is a possible diagnosis of part of what's gone wrong in our faith. Here's how Gerard talks about it. If love and violence are incompatible, the definition of the logos of John chapter 1, in the beginning was the logos. Let's take this into account. The difference between the Greek logos and the logos of John must be an obvious one which gets concealed only in the torturous complications of a type of thought that never succeeds in ridding itself of its own violence. And in a group like this, I don't probably have to make this disclaimer. But look, I'm not denying that Greece was a wonderful, they produced great art and great philosophy and great architecture, but they also did it on the backs of slaves. And they also did it on the, reducing women, seeing women as incapable of rational thought. I just think it's fascinating for Plato that women can be prophets or oracles because that only requires a mouth and vocal cords. They can't be teachers because that would require a brain. And of course that's the ancient world, we might say. But this is a whole system of power and all the rest. And Rome, amazing, all the rest. But it was really nice if you were a citizen and part of the elite. Not so great if you were either lower in the empire or on the outskirts of the empire, the next group who they want to assimilate. Which, by the way, I think should really affect our understanding of Islam. If you lived at around 600 AD, and you wanted to believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you didn't want to be part of the Roman Empire, you needed a good heresy. You needed to not be a Trinitarian. And in a way, you can look at Islam as a heroic attempt to believe in the God and Father of Jesus and the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc. An attempt to be able to do that without getting assimilated into the Roman Empire. I'm not glossing over problems and all the rest, but we ought to pay attention to that fusion. Gerard says, Heidegger is absolutely right to state that there has never been any thought in the West but Greek thought, even when the labels were Christian. Christianity has no special existence in the domain of thought. Continuity of the Greek logos has never been interrupted. Everything is Greek and nothing is Christian. Rhetorical point, whether or not 100% defensible. By cultural Platonism, we mean the unexamined conviction that human institutions have been and are what they are for all eternity, that they have little need to evolve and none whatsoever to be engendered. It is quite evident how universal Platonism manages to obscure any phenomena that contradict it. And so the suggestion is that that powerful philosophical political system has been so deeply embedded with Christian faith that we have to ask the question, to what degree is orthodoxy the version of the faith that has proved most useful in supporting the apparatus of Western civilization, including empire, colonialism, tyranny, domination, rule by elites, mystification, corruption, environmental exploitation, and so on. Now, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I believe in basic Christian orthodoxy, but that doesn't absolve me from needing to ask in what ways has the faith been deeply framed and formed by that political and economic and social project? How have some of our most cherished doctrines been abused in the cause of violence? Is there some other way of understanding the biblical narrative? And my proposal is, and this is something that Gerard models beautifully, is to realize the degree to which we have been trained to read the Bible backwards. We always read back through the sightline of our particular train of theologians. And when you're always reading through the sightline of Orthodox theologians, who are the people who are allowed to keep working because they worked with the Greek and Roman systems and the European systems, colonial systems, and so on, we have reason to say it would be nice to find another sightline so that we're not stuck with only one. And of course, one of our options here is to let our Jewish brothers and sisters try to give us a sightline. Another option is to invite some anthropologists to give us a sightline, which is so much of what Gerard, I think, does. But when you do that, and you look at the Bible narratively, it looks very different. And here's my modest proposal. Now, this is where this isn't in any way a contradiction with René Girard, but here's where I realized, yeah, I saw the same problem he did, and here's a way that I'm trying to deal with it. If there's a critique that some people have with Girard, I don't feel this myself, but I understand people have it. It's that he does a lot of deconstruction and not enough construction. But I really like what Michael said yesterday, a couple of times, that, look, one person can't do everything. Let an anthropologist and a critic and a philosopher do his job, and let some other people do their jobs. But I think if we look at what the primary biblical narrative is, it's the narrative of Exodus. And it's the narrative that is so revolutionary that we just take it for granted that God is on the side of the slaves, not the slaveholders. I mean, that is unbelievable. If we had gotten that, the racial divides that our brothers mentioned earlier, that are so much part of our history, they wouldn't exist. But we didn't get that. We had another biblical narrative working, a narrative of God selects certain people for privilege over other people. Not that God starts with the people at the bottom. And so powerful narrative. And then the prequel to that narrative is the narrative of Genesis, which I don't know if you've ever thought of it, but it gets us from the creation of the world to being in Egypt. Or gets certain people to be in Egypt under slavery. So it functions very much like a prequel. And then the Isaiah narrative, which I think is sort of the sequel to the Exodus narrative, because once you're in the Promised Land, it turns out it's not so good. If everybody around you wants a piece of your milk and honey, then you're constantly in violence to defend yourself. And you then realize you need a vision that's bigger than a Promised Land. You need a vision of a promised time when the nations don't study war anymore. You need a vision of a nonviolent time. And so what we have in these three narratives is not a totalizing meta-narrative, an us-them story that legitimates domination and purification or scapegoating. We have a multi-narrative that creates a story space instead of a storyline, in which a million good stories can emerge. My little mnemonic device for this, if you think of it as length, width, and height, then what we have is this expanding universe, where there is a grain to the universe, as Dr. King said, that bends toward justice, an arc to the universe. It's going somewhere. It's creating more room for more creation, more liberation, more reconciliation. Anything that opposes those, then, is opposing the unfolding of the universe. And here again, Girard offers some wonderful tools and wonderful insights. What works against creation? Humans involved in destruction. And how do we get involved in destruction? By our competing desires that make us unaware of care of creation and only make us interested in the acquisition and control and conquest and destruction. What works against liberation? Domination. And how do we dominate? We dominate by creating systems of rules and prohibitions that help us maintain the peace by having some people dominate over other people. How do we oppose reconciliation? We do it by violence and our mimetic rivalry is certainly constantly leading to the breakdown of reconciliation. And then that gives meaning to the solutions that we see in the biblical narrative. Salvation from that destructive tendency. And isn't it interesting that salvation involves learning a creative desire as opposed to a destructive desire? It involves the transformation of desire. Thy will be done is a very different desire than my will be done. Liberation. It involves, instead of domination, it involves self-service, and service and self-giving, and reconciliation. And this is a place where I think we all have so much to do. And I felt it so much in the beautiful talk this morning. When we think about education and formation as the developments of communities of practice, communities of positive imitation. And this just then changes so many of our understanding of God, some of our cherished doctrines, our understanding of salvation. And so many of us grew up in an environment where ultimately we needed to be saved from God. Very different to say, no, we're not being saved from God, we're being saved by God from our own self-destructive cycles of violence. Whether we're the victims or the perpetrators, we start realizing we need to be saved from this. And you know, if you look at the Old Testament in a way, before the kings, it's being saved from the reality of being saved from being victims. But as soon as you have power, then the need to be saved from being victimizers. And powerful, then salvation forces this different understanding of salvation, challenges us to have a different understanding of what it means to say a statement like, Jesus died for our sins. And this to me is one of the sticking points. I'll just tell you, in my travels, I hear this all over the place. People are saying, I'm moving with you, I'm going with you. But the place where I get hung up is, what does it mean to say Jesus died for our sins? Because when they say died for our sins, in their mind, that little preposition for means payment, substitution. It brings in all of that sacrificial kind of language. And so, in fact, when I was in Amsterdam a week ago, this beautiful young Dutch Reformed minister comes up to me, and he's got tears in his eyes. He says, I really need to talk to you. He says, I'm struggling. It's about this Jesus died for our sins. What does that mean? And I just said to him, I took an aspirin for my headache. Just let that sit for a minute. And he says, I get it. That's all. You know? To say I took an aspirin for my headache doesn't mean I took an aspirin to pay for my headache. I took an aspirin as a substitute for my headache. No, it means I took an aspirin to address, to cure, to heal, to grapple with, the problem of my headache. So I think there's huge possibilities. And I'm going to skip ahead here because I want to finish up and first have some time for some questions. So this is our challenge. Needing to revision and get a fresh take on what our real story is, this good news of the kingdom of God that, again, we have to translate in our own language today. I'll just end with a quote from another, almost end with a quote from another important thinker of the last few decades, Ivan Illich. He said, neither revolution nor reformation can ultimately change a society. Rather, you must tell a new powerful tale, one so persuasive that it sweeps away the old myths and becomes the preferred story, one so inclusive that it gathers all the bits of our past and present into a coherent whole, one that even shines some light into the future so that we can take the next step. If you want to change a society, then you have to tell an alternative story. And this to me is our challenge, because we're all going through almost a kind of exorcism of purging unhelpful versions of the story that we inherited or that are still running rampant. And that's a process. We can't rush it. It takes, as Gerard said, almost infinite patience. But as we begin to purge it, sooner or later, we have to start telling a positive news story. That is the story that we know is needed and has an effect in our world. And all of us involved in the church and in the work of theology have to say, how can this be articulated in sermons and books and creeds and confessions and songs and prayers and mission and prophetic action and art and research, so that it really can get out and be shared with people everywhere. Well, that's a good place for me to stop. And we've got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes for some questions. So let's jump in.